Hello, and thank you for joining the session. Today we're going to keep working on our Stalker project. Yesterday we started working on our command bus for this application. We got pretty far into it, started working with a little bit of validation with required fields. We actually were able to bring in Tactician and start doing some things with that. So what I'd like to do now is sort of follow up on this implementation and see if we can build a little more into it. Maybe start looking at doing some testing, and then let's see what we have time for after that. Feel free to send chat messages my way. Hopefully the chat bot is working better today than it was on other days. So definitely send me chats, and I'll try and keep in touch as we go. So let's hop into the code. We got Astrocasts itself open. Let's go into Stalker. All right, so we do have our command bus, and what we have in here, what we worked on yesterday was creating the commands for import. This was sort of the just a simple example of what I expect the commands to look like. We were using a command base class that was using convenient immutability to make sure that the objects were immutable. One of the things that we ran into during this session was I wanted to return static here, and that didn't work. So I kind of did a little bit of research, and something I might do on a future episode of Astrocasts is work on this a little bit more. But I started talking to Sarah Goldman about this after a lengthy Twitter discussion with other people, and I sort of put together sort of a request for almost a proto RFC to try and see what would happen if we added a static return type. And what sort of behavior we would get from that. And she took that and went ahead and created a pull request. Well, not a pull request. She started a branch actually implementing this. Looks like there's tests here now that weren't there before, which is awesome. But what this actually does is gives PHP the ability to have static as a return type. So there's definitely more work that needs to be done in here. Proper RFC needs to be created, but that's something I might do as a separate Astrocast session at some point. So if you were watching the last session and saw this and had more questions about it or whatever, this could actually be something that's going to be really cool coming out of that. In the meantime, we are using self as the return type here. We also talked about using static instead of self to make sure that things worked as well. The validation was a little iffy. This is probably not the best way to do this. So what I'd like to do is sort of try to do a better version, something that isn't just a while loop. So let's see, the best way might be to use array union, or array, it's one of the array functions. So let's do array diff. Want to double check. So it's compares array 1 against one or more arrays and returns the values in array that are not present in any of the other arrays. So what I think I can do is do array diff with the required keys and then get the keys that are actually passed in the input. So if I do it in that order, I think if I end up with any values, that those will be keys that were required that weren't actually in there. So let's go ahead and change this. So it's array diff static required fields, and we'll do array keys of payload. So if we're doing count greater than 0, let's see, where am I missing something here? There we go. So if the count is greater than 0, then we're going to return false. And let's see if this still sort of behaves the way we would expect. So let's do import. And again, I'm using Tinkerwell for this so that I can do some quick testing of the code in sort of a live environment. Import validate. So that's false, which is good. So let's do item ID. And name. Oh, undefined method, toString. All right, so this is true. And if I comment this out, it should be false again. All right, so I think this works the way it was yesterday, or on the last session. I wasn't really prepared to try to work through this in my brain, but this works here. So the other thing we had was allowed fields. So allowed fields is going to be the payload values that should actually be allowed. So what I'd really like to do is combine these two values, and I want to remove any fields that shouldn't actually be there. So if we look at the correct version here and say import to array, to payload, my bad. What we should end up there is with nothing. I'm going to take these values. So I actually want a proper object. Okay, so what I can do now is say add something arbitrary, some new key, and let's see there, unexpected constant. I actually wrote the Tinkerwell people to see if this is an option that we can have. I'm not going to go through it again, but you'll see that the trailing comma in the array goes away as soon as I execute the code. That's not super handy in this particular type of case. So you can see here that the output is that it includes foo bar. So what I'd like to do is filter out any keys that aren't expected. So I'm going to say, let's see here. And then after this, we're going to actually write some tests so that we can start testing this functionality to make sure it's working as expected. So we have, let's do payload keys. Since we're going to use this more often, I'm actually going to replace this with the value, and then we can use this. So let's do keys to remove. We're going to use the same logic here. So we're going to do an array diff, but this time we're going to say that we're going to use all of the required fields plus the allowed fields. But instead of, we're going to reverse the logic though. So we're going to do array diff payload. So this time we're going to get all of the keys that are in payload that aren't in either required or allowed keys. Let's do, I'm going to try something I haven't done before. Let's do static required fields. I can't remember. I feel like plus might actually work here. Let's see if it actually does. Required fields, allowed fields. Keys to remove. This key and set payload key. All right, so this should remove any keys that weren't specifically specified. So let's reload this again. Oh, I didn't do it. So, so this is the other tricky part. I need, since I have the validation as a standalone thing, it needs to be called outside. So let's do payload. There we go. So the reason that I have to do this, at least with the current design, is because I'm sort of expecting that the payload being passed in may be different than what we were expecting if the payload for some reason was persisted. So we're going to check the validation of the payload before we instantiate it with from payload. So, but rather than having the validation happen as a part of this step, which might actually be better in some cases, I have it done separately. So let's do payload validate stalker from payload must be of type array bool given. Ow. All right, so yeah, we're gonna have to change the interface. I'm mixing two different implementations of this that I've done in the past. And I kind of ran into this yesterday. I don't think bool alone is probably a good decision. Like returning false here, I don't think I like that idea. So we're gonna switch this to array, and the response then is going to be the payload. And here, on-site payload keys key, that actually is a typo. We want payload. So we're removing it from the payload itself. All right, so what we can see here is that the required keys were accepted, but this foo was not allowed. So let's do, let's add another parameter here. Let's do type, and we'll say toys. Rerun that, and we'll see that toys isn't allowed, or it's not showing up anyway. Felipe is asking, is it too bad if we use Laravel's validation rules for commands in the command bus implementation? That's not actually something that I would care about, honestly. For me, the validation logic, whether you're binding yourself to using something like whether you're using something like Laravel's validation or using something like, let's see, it's Beverly's assert. So I know a lot of people use the assert package. There's a couple of them here. A lot of people use this one. There's also the Web Mozart implementation. So in my thinking, if you're binding to a very specific assert implementation for your validation layer and are okay with that, I would think that you should be able to use any assertion library or any validation library, including Laravel's. I don't know that everybody would necessarily agree with that take, but that's sort of my take on it. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if you've run it. I don't know, Felipe, if you've actually run into cases where people were telling you don't do that or it's bad. I'd be curious to know kind of what your experience has been on that. But for my money and for my take, you could totally decide to use Laravel validation if you wanted to at the command layer or the command bus layer. So what we need to do now is, if there's a required field missing, we actually need to do something different, which in this case is going to be throwing an exception. Let's do command bus. Let's actually create something here for that. So let's do command bus. Let's do valid payload. And let's do extends. What's a good invalid argument? Yeah, let's do that. So invalid payload, thing that I will do here, let's create a static constructor called public. Let's do valid payload, required field missing. Let's do message string. So now we should be able to go back to our command, and instead let's do throw new invalid payload. And then we'll do rediff. No, we could actually do multiple of these. Yeah, okay. Let's do that actually. We'll do missing fields. Required field missing. Let's actually add another one called required fields missing. And we'll do, okay. And this one is going to be more or less the same. It's going to be more complicated, but let's do This is getting way more complicated than I actually thought it was going to be, which sometimes happens. So let's do fields. We want to implode, comma, and let's see. I'm actually going to remove this version because we can do something here where we can say payload missing, and we'll do create a label and do field label. Fields. So if there's only one field missing, we can do missing field or fields. Now, there might be a better way to pluralize that, but this is what I'm going to try for now. If we go back to command, that means we can do required field missing. Let's see what's going on here now. Not found an invalid payload. Oh, I typed it wrong. I don't really like this name now that I'm looking. Let's do missing fields. Missing required fields. There we go. So let's try our implementation again. Let's try this by removing name. Array to string conversion. Okay, so I didn't do something right. Line 18. Oh, I need to do field string. There we go. Now I think it'll work. All right, so invalid payload with message payload missing required field name. If I remove item ID, missing required fields, item ID, and name. So looks like this is working all right for the simple validation that we're doing here. It's also cleaning up when there are fields that are not present. The thing that we haven't tried yet is to say is to test out adding an allowed field. So let's do allowed fields, and let's do type. I'm not going to bother creating a constant for this because I'm not actually expecting this behavior. There we go. Oh, interesting. Would have expected that type would have been left, so there must still be something wrong here. Because I do have type. All right, so there's something wrong with this. Let me... Actually, I think this would probably work as well. There we go. So that plus actually wasn't doing what I thought it was, I think. We could actually test that out pretty easily. A plus B. Yeah, I don't actually know what that's doing. But what works is to just pass in the allowed fields as the second array to also check from. So what we end up seeing here is that type is going to be kept from the filtered list because it's allowed, but if it's not set at all, it doesn't cause an error. It's only if one of these fields here is missing that we're going to get an error. So I feel pretty confident in our base class here. So I think that the validation stuff is actually pretty solid. So let's go back here. Command validation, allowed fields, testing the command bus. These actually should probably be outdented a little bit because they should go along with building the command bus itself. So let's maybe build something here, because like we've manually built something to test that the code is working, but would be better if we were actually doing proper testing. So let's see here. I don't think I have PHP unit installed in this project. I guess it is. All right. I guess it comes built into the Laravel application. So let's go to tests. Let's go unit test, because we're going to do some unit testing here. Let's do a test on command bus. And let's do... I want to make this abstract. Let's see if that still works. Yeah, I think that still works. Because I don't think we actually want to be able to instantiate an instance of a class. So for command bus, let's build a fixture, which will be an implementation of, or something that extends the command. Let's do command with required fields only. Extends command. And we'll do command with allowed fields only. And then we'll do one that combines them. So for this one, we're going to do required. Oh, we're just going to keep it simple here. And then we'll do test allowed field. And we're going to copy these into the others as well. So required field. And allowed field. And then create a command test. And I think we want to extend the base test case, but I want to double check here. Yeah. So we'll do extends case. We'll do it. It creates command with allowed fields only. No, we don't want to do that. So I want to do. So I'm kind of second guessing some of this design right now. So instead of creates, I think we're going to do it validates. So we'll do successfully. Oh, this isn't extending either, which would be part of the problem. So we're going to do command with only. Now we can. There we go. Why is this not working? All right. From validate, we're going to do. Whoa. Tried some new code formatting, and I'm not sure I like it. There we go. That's weird. So let's do validate. I'll have to deal with that later. See what we had for that. So test allowed field and test required field, required, and test ignored field, ignored. Wow. Wow. Okay. And then this assert equals. Expected value here is going to be allowed and required, but we don't expect to have ignored. There we go. So let's try it now and see if we got this working right. Okay, so expected, oh. It actually is expecting the whole thing. So let's do allowed and required. Okay, so the required field is expecting it to be there. This is the allowed only field, so we'll do with allowed both. There we go. It's always nice when you can see the unit tests actually fail for a legitimate reason. All right, so it validates when allowed fields with allowed field only. Oh, well, it looks like I was confused elsewhere. So validates command with Okay. All right, so let's do what we were doing earlier too. So let's do it validates command with only allowed successfully. We're going to do more or less the same thing. We're just going to use a different class and different set of expectations. So we'll do a valid command with both allowed and required, but we're going to switch this to command with only allowed. And so I'm not going to do anything with required field, and I'm actually not going to check for it either. Okay, so that works as expected. And then we're going to do the inverse as well. So let's copy this value, or this test. Command with only required. I'm going to steal this. Okay, so test required. So must have, so again, good to see the test failed with required field. There we go. Okay, cool. Now I need to do a test for both of these. For the inverse, so it fails to, it's going to rename these, it fails to and so what I'm going to do here is put everything in that except for what it actually needs. So this actually doesn't make sense. The required one, this test is the one that doesn't make sense because there's no way to really test this since there's no required field. So it's only this case. So if I remove the required field from here, this should give us an exception. Likewise, if I remove required here, it should also give us an exception. I think the way that exceptions are trapped has changed in newer versions of PHP-Unit. All right, payload missing required fields. So then we can do this, expect exception, valid payload. Let's see if that, all right, so that solves that one. So what I think I want to do with this, let's see if they can do anything. Expect exception message. Be great if I could actually get access to the exception somehow. So I could do some more interesting checks on it. Let's do, well, I'm just going to leave it like this for now because it does actually do something, so that's good. So, of course, the nice thing about having the test in place is that now I know that the base class works as expected, and if anything changes later, it's going to let me know, hopefully, where to fix it. All right, so we have our commands, we have the handler. The handler right now isn't actually doing anything for our import handler. So what I think I'd like to do with the rest of the time remaining is look at what we had originally set up for our console commands and see if we can implement those with the command bus rather than writing it all locally here in this command. rather than renaming this command, what I'm going to do is add a brand new command. So we're going to do php artisan make command. Let's do catalog. I'm going to look at the help again because I like to do that sometimes. Make command. So the name of the command will be import catalog, or is it? No, I think it's items, isn't it? Just wanted to double check. Yeah, import catalog item. And we can use command equals there we go. And then let's also do rename catalog item while we're here, because that's the other bit of code that we have in place. All right. If we look at wiring, what we did the first time around, when we do the import, is we actually generated the ID and then we did the saving. So this is more or less the code that needs to exist inside our command handler. Where it's a little questionable is where this item ID should be generated. So I need to think about that for a second. I think it should probably still be generated inside the command itself. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start with import. We have a signature here. Command description should be import catalog item. Handle doesn't do anything currently. And I'm actually going to remove these placeholders because it doesn't really make sense to have them there at this point. So import catalog item. Let's do name. And make that be a required field. So we're using this syntax to specify what should actually be there. I'm going to copy this over into import. So once we're inside handle, we can get access to the name using this. So we'll do name. And then we should be able to generate the item ID on our own. The thing that we're going to need access to is our command bus. So I'm going to use auto wiring for this. We'll do command bus. Initialize properties. And so I should be able to command bus dispatch. We're going to dispatch import command. And we're going to dispatch import item ID. And I'm going to do placeholder for now and import name. And we get the name from the command. Item ID is actually something that I'd like to refactor at some point. I'm not sure when we're going to get to that. But if I generate this, you'll see that it's actually saying that it's giving back an event sourcing aggregate ID. Same thing as if we do from string. This is the thing that I think I'd like to try to fix somehow. Because otherwise, if you have an item ID instance created this way, PHP Storm is going to treat it as an aggregate root ID. It's not going to treat it as an item ID, which is really annoying. But we'll do generate for now. And so let's just double check this. Do item ID. So it only has access to toString. If we cast it to an item ID, still only has toString. So I guess I don't know because didn't actually do anything fancy on here. I just know that if this were type hinted against receiving an item ID, somehow this wouldn't actually work. So let's do item ID toString. So one of the things I'm doing here is keeping the command bus layer all using primitives. So even though we can use item ID as a domain value object, part of the domain model, I'm actually just going to be passing in the string representation of it to the command. But this should be enough, in theory, to actually trigger the functionality to kick off in the command handler. So let's see if we do this now. Artisan, I think we should have catalog. Yep, so we have catalog import. And if I don't pass in a name, it gives me an error. If I do help, it gives me help including import catalog item. So I'm going to do import, let's do toys. Now we'll do elephant. All right, so this is giving us a dump. This is actually the dump that's coming from the import handler. So it's dumped from import handler, it's taking the payload. We can see that everything gets in here as we sort of expected it would. So what we're going to do now is actually finish this import handler to actually do something useful. So let's see here. Oh, let's go back to wiring because we want this side of it. So now that we have the import, the information for the import command, what we need to do is do this. And I think this is where we're finally going to see sort of where this static binding is going to be kind of annoying. Paste. We are going to need access to our catalog, so let's build that here as well. So this is a catalog interface, catalog initialize properties. This is all set up to auto wire already. Here we go. So item ID equals item ID from string command item ID. So that's going to get us access to an item ID. And here's where this falls apart for me. We can see here that import function for item is complaining that it needs to have an item ID, but it's getting an instance of aggregate root ID. So this is where it gets kind of messy for me. So the way to fix that, because PHP doesn't care, actually. PHP is going to accept this no problem. What we can do, though, is use the type hinting to say that we want it to be an item ID. So this item ID value should be treated like an item ID. Now at least the IDE has a better idea of what's going on. So the solution for this that I'm going to try and talk to Frank about is getting this interface for aggregate root ID, seeing what we can do here to maybe rename this or change the response type to something else. It may not actually work though, at least not the way that I want it to, unless people are using PHP 7.4. So I may just bump this project up to that so that we could actually do that. So if I do self here, what PHP Storm is doing is giving me an error, but it's saying that this is only an issue, or this would be an issue, like a compile time issue, for anything prior to PHP 7.4. But the interesting thing is that PHP Storm actually doesn't, it still executes it. So if I do 2, you'll see that now if this is essentially gone. If I'm able to do that, then I would be able to get the type hinting directly from the code without having to give any additional type hints. So this may not be something that actually needs to be addressed by Frank in event sauce itself, but we'll have to see. If it's something that we can make life easier, great. If not, then the fix for userland and for me would be to use PHP 7.4, and I'd get the stuff that I want. In the meantime, we get to do this trick because I'm not on PHP 4 yet. I'm going to run the command. So it's going to do import. We need to get the string here from the command. So name, and then we're not going to do a rename. I'm not going to do a dump, but I am going to do a save item. So in theory, what we should end up with is inside our project, let's see, in the database anyway. Hybrid Postgres. I think that might be what I'm using actually for this. Yeah, so what we should end up in our event store should be a brand new item. So let's go ahead and run this. So let's do import elephant, and we'll do 2019 12:05, and with any luck, this is just going to work. Okay, cool. It worked. Didn't give me any feedback. Let's check the database now and see how well this actually worked for us. I'm going to pull table plus over here. All right, so right beforehand, I'd done a reload and it had 112. Now it has 113. The event type was imported, and the payload has name with elephant 2019 12:05. Let's do it again. And if I reload, we should have 114, and we should have would have expected. What did I do wrong here? Not sure why it's dropping that last character. Yeah, let's discard that. Maybe I accidentally pasted something. No, huh? There we go. I don't know why that was coming up like that, but the data is actually correct here. It's just doing something weird. So let's go ahead now and see if we can get the other function working, or the other command working as well. So we have import. The other thing that we had in our original test was rename, which is handled up here. So rename now is going to be slightly different because instead of creating something and saving it, what we're going to do is find it, modify it, and then save it. So this is sort of like the other part of the way that command buses can be used. Let's go to commands. So we had import before. Let's create rename. And then we'll have to create a handler called rename handler. And for rename, let's do extends command bus, command. And required fields are going to be ID, name equals name. So this is really very similar to this original implementation. So I'm going to remove allowed fields. So I'm actually going to copy this implementation. The difference here is the intent. The intent for import versus the intent for rename is what gets captured inside the event store with the name. So even though they look the same now, they could actually change down the line, but it also means something different. So it's totally fine that these look the same. Where it's going to be different, as I mentioned, is inside the handler. So I'm going to copy the handler because some of it's actually going to be very similar. But rather than bring in the import command, the command here is going to be rename. And instead of creating an item ID from the command, what we're going to do is we're going to use this and then creating a new item with that ID. We're instead going to use this ID to look up an item. So let's do item, catalog, find item, and we need to pass it an item ID. And then we're going to call item rename command name and save it out. So we should be able to run, if we were to dispatch the rename command, it should just work. What we don't have yet is setting up the rename command. So let's go ahead and copy the implementation here for, let's see, do we have command bus? No. All right, so I'm going to remove these comments, and then I'm going to copy everything from import from this variable in the constructor on down and replace what was here. All right, rename. So import is going to become rename. This technically works, but it's wrong. So I'm going to make sure to change those. The other thing that we need to do is modify the signature to accept the name, but also an ID. So we'll do name, but first we need an item ID. And rather than generating the item ID here, what we're going to do is we're going to get item ID argument. And so it's already going to be a string, so we don't have to do something different. So it's similar to the import command, but the implementation is slightly different. It's a little simpler because we're just taking the raw data from the command line versus doing something different with it. So let's go ahead and run rename. If we look back at our database, you can see that this is the one that had the C in it. And that was ID 115. So the aggregate root ID is actually the item ID in this case. So we're going to take this UUID and pass that as the first argument, and we're going to rename it to C2. And if all worked as expected, we should be able to see aggregate root version 2 should have ID 116, and the name should be updated. So let's see what we got here. So we have 116. We do have aggregate root version 2, which is good. And we see that the name passed in for that event was C2. So this is all working, which is really awesome. I'd like to not sound as surprised as I am, but it is nice when these two pieces start coming together. So we started out with the event store and the events. We started building the command bus, and then started to layer on the actual commands and command handlers to essentially do what the command, or what we were doing by hand before inside our little wiring function. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove this wiring command now. Git remove commands, because we don't really need it. It's not serving its purpose. We have enough stuff, and especially with the addition of Tinkerwell, we can do a lot of things without having to start playing with that little command to try and execute stuff for us. So we got rid of wiring. The thing I wanted to double check on was whether or not our command bus is actually doing something with the validation stuff, which I don't think it is. So here's what we're doing. We're assuming this is going to be it's still using the Boolean. So everything's still working, even though it's not actually working. So what I'm going to do here is change this such that we're going to do class name validate. We need to capture this output. And before I do that, I'm going to show why. I'm going to do this rename command again. And let's go to rename catalog item, and let's do foo bar. So the way that this should work is that the extra data here, this foo and bar, should be filtered out. In reality, it's not going to, because we haven't actually done the things to require that. So for, let's see, I don't know why it's modifying that. Must be doing something wrong. Some key command is not working as expected. But here we can see name, payload has name elephant C3. Would have expected that. I'm in rename. Let's try C4. Unless I haven't actually saved. Did I save this? I thought I did. Oh, I know what's going on. This is the aggregate. So that's that payload is actually the event payload. That took way longer for me to figure out than I probably should have. If I look at rename handler, here is where I'm going to do dump command to payload. And we'll see that by the time it gets here, it shouldn't have anything that is not required or allowed, but we're going to see that it actually does. So it still has foobar and bat-baz. So what we need to do is modify the command bus, tactician command bus, to modify the payload. So we want this to instead be payload equals validate. Let's see what happens here. C5. And here we see now that the command bus is actually coming in. By the time it gets to the command handler, it's actually working as we expect. So I'm happy about that. Okay. Looks like we're almost at time here, so I think I should probably be done. So do one last bit here to close. All right, so command validation, I'm going to consider that done. We did a bit of testing on the command bus. I'm going to say that we did command bus and command. So we actually did testing on command, so I think that's probably good. I'm pretty happy with how that worked. What else did we do? Nothing else on here actually got done. So we did manage to add a couple of things, which was nice. We have added, let's see, we added some commands. We added the import catalog item and rename catalog item. We removed the old wiring command so that we don't actually need to have that. We did we added some tests, so we actually have stuff in the testing, which is pretty good. And we finalized the import command itself, and also the import handler, and added the import handler and rename handler. So altogether, not too bad. Thanks for joining. If you have more questions or anything like that, you can hit me up on Twitter. I'm going to see if I can find a project to drop everybody else into from here. So anybody who's on Twitch anyway. we're going to see if we can get some people onto a different project. Oh, that's not what I expected to happen. That's weird. Why? Huh. All right. Well, maybe I'm not actually going to do a raid today. I was going to raid people, find a project to raid, but I don't actually think it's working the way that I would expect it to. So let's see, raid channel. All right, I'm going to raid to Bald Bearded Builder. So thank you all for joining. If you have more questions or anything along the way, feel free to check out the code on GitHub. I'm actually going to push that as we speak. Apply changes from session 6. I think this is session 6 now. So that should be online. If you want to take a look and start playing around with where we're at, that'd be great. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Thank you.